Hey, morning, guys. Obviously, wish we could be together this morning, but with the weather like it is, I think everyone made the decision that it's probably safest for everyone to stay home. And so, what the elders asked me to do is go ahead and to record a message for you guys. And that way, at your homes, you can have your own morning devotionals and things like that. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to continue on with our study of Jesus the servant. And what kind of servant was he? What qualities and characteristics did he have? And I wanted to start this morning with an example. Now, this is going to seem a little weird. Remember, this lesson was written to be preached, not seeming like one-on-one in a video, but it's a interesting example. There's a guy named Ryan Bates, and he is a man of purpose. He has a goal in life. His goal is to own every single copy of the movie Speed. You know, the one from 1994 starring Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock. Yeah, not only that, he wants to own every VHS copy of the movie. So it is a strange pursuit, but he has made it his life's goal in there. And everything he does is to try to meet that life goal. And it's just to point out that people, generally, we look for something to define us. We look for some sort of purpose. Not every purpose is noble in its pursuit, but we often look for purpose. For Christians, our purpose is obviously more noble than finding every copy of Speed on VHS. It's an eternal purpose. And it's also important that we have a sense of purpose as Christians, because purpose gives us a sense of who we are and what we're trying to accomplish. It gives us a means of dedicating ourselves to a cause that's really beyond who we are as an individual. It's something greater than just ourselves. It's a goal that motivates and fuels our lives. It gives us meaning and direction. Purpose gives us a place to start and a place to head towards. It gives us clarity on what's important and what's not important. And it inspires us to make significant contributions toward that goal. Now, I say all that because that's going to be our first lesson this morning. That Jesus was a purposeful servant. He was a man of purpose. Everything he did was to accomplish a particular purpose. And as Christians, we need to be the same way in our service. So the first thing I want to look at, and I'm going to go through this a little quicker than I would have in a sermon this morning, just to help with upload speeds and things like that. But the first thing that we're going to look at is the proclamation of Jesus' purpose. What did Jesus say his purpose was? Because when you read through the Bible, the gospel accounts devote a lot of time talking about the things of Jesus' life and what he did. We could find him teaching multitudes. He's training disciples. Occasionally he casts out demons. He heals lots of sick people, even raises a couple of them from the dead. And he spends a good portion of his preaching and teaching, his time preaching and teaching about the kingdom of God. And I say all that to say Jesus was a busy person. But if we step back and look at his whole life, we should also see that not only was he busy, but he was purposed in what he was doing. And maybe the place that we find his purpose so plainly stated is Luke chapter 19 and verse 10. It says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost." Another verse we might look at that would also show us a glimpse of his purpose is found in Mark chapter 10 and verse 45. It's a verse that we talked about last week. "For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many." Jesus was a servant. He came to seek and save the lost. He came to give his life a ransom for many. And I wanted to focus on that last part of that verse in Mark chapter 10 there. Because, again, when you look at everything Jesus did, all the teaching and the healing and the casting out and all of that, it leads to one place. everything he did leads to one particular event, and that was to the cross. His purpose in being a servant was to give his life a ransom for many. Now, with that being said, what was the proof of his purpose? In other words, how do we know that he was purposed? And maybe the way that we would define it is this way. When you see an athlete and they're training all the time, and even in the off season or something, they're trying to get better at what they do. We say, well, that person is dedicated. Look at all the things they're doing. Or maybe it's a scientist or someone like that who's trying to invent something, and they spend all of their time to focus on that thing. We say, well, look at how dedicated they are. Let's look at what Jesus had to endure, because I think when you see what he endured, you see that he was a man of purpose. So a couple of things that came to my mind. The first thing is, man, he was just physically tired all the time. Life was hard in the first century. You had to walk everywhere you went. There was no fast food. It was tough. In John chapter 4 and verse 6, of course, we think of John chapter 4, the lady at the well and the exchange that he has with her. But notice what it says. He said he got to Jacob's well. Jesus was wearied from his journey, and he sat down beside the well. In Mark chapter 6 and verse 31, he said to him, speaking to his disciples, "Come by yourselves to a desolate place and rest for a while." And then it adds to that story, there were many coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And then, of course, I think about Matthew chapter 26. There in the about 35-36, where Jesus is in the garden, he's praying, and he's brought a few disciples with him, in a handful, the inner circle, so to speak. And every time he comes back to say something to them or to spend time with them, what happens? Well, he finds them asleep. He has to chastise them, to try to get them to stay awake. He encourages them, try to get them to stay awake, and still nothing. They're just so tired. They're physically exhausted because they were always going, and things were so emotional and difficult there at the end. So Jesus was physically tired all the time, it seems. And yet he had to fulfill his purpose, so he continued on. Think about another burden that he had to bear. He was abandoned by his followers. You look at before the cross, John chapter 6 and verse 66, it says, "After this, many of the disciples turned back and they no longer walked with him." Imagine how disheartening that must have been to have all of these people and really believe that you're making a connection and everyone is following what you're saying, and then all of a sudden they turn and leave, and to recognize that they're doing it simply because of physical things that they could have gotten, and not because of the spiritual benefit that came from being a disciple. You also remember during his arrest, and again, we often focus on Peter's denial of Jesus, but Scripture records for us that all of them left. They all left and fled, according to Mark chapter 14 and verse 50. Jesus had to go through that alone. Everyone abandoned him, and especially the disciples. I mean, these are the apostles. These were men that he invested 3.5 years or 3 years in, and then in his hour of need, they're gone. He's alone, and so there he is by himself, being abandoned over and over again, and yet Jesus had a purpose to fulfill. And he went on to do it. He met opposition every step of the way. You find the Bible talks about the reason that some would seek after him. There were those who were seeking truth. There were those who were, seeking benefits. But there were those who were looking out and looking to find him because they wanted to oppose him. In John chapter 6 and verse 26. Jesus has an exchange with the Pharisees. He says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you are seeking me, but not because you saw signs, but because you ate and filled the loaves." Again, there were those who followed Jesus because of physical things. In John chapter 6 and verse 15, he says, "Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain himself. He had people who didn't understand his message, and they were going to try to force him to be king. And how frustrating that must have been for him, that they didn't get the nature of what he was saying. And then there were also, again, the Pharisee side of it. Mark chapter 8 and verse 11. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from a sign from heaven to test him. And then the next verse shows us that Jesus realizes this is part of them challenging him, and it says that he sighed deeply in his spirit. I mean, sighed deeply. It comes from a Greek word that means to groan. He was so aggravated and frustrated with their constant opposition, and here they come again, and it's just, you can, as you read the page, you almost get a picture in your mind of him just going, oh, here we go again. Well, another challenge, another argument, another debate that I'm going to have. And then Mark chapter 3 verse 6 says that there were some who just were trying to hurt him. It says that the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. Now, for you and I, we read that, and again, we focus on the last part of it, and yeah, I mean, rightly so. They were trying to destroy him, but there's also a part in there that we have to recognize, is that it says the Pharisees, and they held counsel with the Herodians. Now, for those of us who may not be aware, the Pharisees and the Herodians didn't get along at all. They disagreed on a bunch of things. These are two separate groups, and left to their own, they didn't like each other. And yet here we find that even these groups that had so much that they argued about and so much that they disagreed on, they came together, and they worked together, band together, trying to figure out how to destroy Jesus. And then you look at the cross, and the Sanhedrin sets up a kangaroo court to sentence him to death. And again, how frustrating that must have been, just on a personal level, because Jesus could run circles around them in debate. He had done it so many times, and yet here he is having to listen to these fools, these proud individuals trying to make accusations against him that are untrue, that are easily disproved, and Jesus has to endure it because he knows he can argue his way out of it. He even knows that he could call a band of angels and they could come save him, but he was going to the cross, and this was a necessary part of it. And then when you read Mark chapter 14 and verse 65, it said during that trial that some began to spit on him, to cover his face, and to strike him, saying to him, "Prophesy." And the guards received him with blows. Not only was Jesus having to endure just the turmoil of being, called a liar and someone who was blaspheming, but he had to endure physical violence. They hit him, they struck him, they spit on him. How humiliating that is. And Jesus has to endure all this, even though he doesn't have to. He has the power to stop it at any time he wants. And yet, Jesus had to fulfill his purpose. And then you get to, in my mind, what is the biggest indicator that he was a man of purpose, and that was that he was crucified. Again, we all know Jesus was crucified. It's the reason that you and I get together on Sundays, is to remember that sacrifice. But what's happened is, because 2,000 years has passed since people were crucified, it's sort of been sanitized in our mind. In fact, most images that we have today on the cross are of Jesus on the cross, or he has some his hands and feet have nails driven through them, but for the most part, his body is largely untouched. He hardly bleeds at all, like maybe just out of the wounds a little bit, or maybe even he has the spear in the side, and that's the depiction that we get of crucifixion. But the reality of the crucifixion is gruesome. What Jesus endured is uncomfortable to really consider what it means. Um, First of all, we find out that Jesus is scourged before the crucifixion. Now, if you're not familiar with that is, I'll try to describe it, being mindful that there may be young ones watching this, and also it's a difficult thing to imagine. But imagine being beaten with a whip that has pieces of bone and pottery tied into the end of it. And imagine what that would do to the human body. And so a lot of times there's even records of internal organs being exposed and people not surviving the scourging. It was so brutal. And so Jesus went through that. By the time he carries his cross, his back is an open wound. He's had a crown of thorns pressed on his head, digging into the skin and under the skin. And again, just a brutal thing. I have a crown of thorns in my office. If you're ever wanting to try to go put it on your head, come on in and give it a try. A lot of people have come in and sort of hovered it over their heads, and it doesn't take them long to realize how uncomfortable that would be. And so Jesus, he endures that even before he gets to the cross. And then the text says that he has to carry what's called the patabolum, which is the cross piece to the cross, the part that his hands would have been nailed into. He has to carry that, and at one point he is so beaten and so weary that someone has to carry it for him. He gets to the cross, and they drive these metal spikes through his wrist and his feet. And for those who may not be aware, the cross was designed to prolong death. It was intended to be a brutal thing that could last for days. And basically what would happen is the person who was on the cross would have to struggle. They would have to let off of their weight to take the pain from their feet, having the nails driven in. And then they would also have to, because of the position they're in, stand up on those feet to get a breath of air. And so you could imagine being in constant struggle, trying to take the weight off your feet and then sit up to try to get a breath just so that you can breathe, and then go back down. And you have to remember, at the time he's doing this, sliding up and down, that wood is not finished. His back is raw. Just that is brutal. And again, I'm trying not to get too graphic with this, but it is a graphic thing. It is an awful thing. And Jesus endured it, and he went through it because he had to fulfill his purpose. Now, I say all that to get to this point. Why talk about that? Why talk about the fact that Jesus was often weary, that he was often abandoned, that he was often opposed, and that he endured the cross? Because he gave us an example as a servant. He was purposed, and nothing was going to stop him from fulfilling that purpose. He knew where he was going. He knew what he needed to do, and it didn't matter what he endured. It didn't matter what he had to go through. He was going to get to that purpose and fulfill it. And for us as servants, we need to be the same way. We need to be purposed. When we look at all the suffering that Jesus endured, we recognize that being a servant isn't always easy. It is going to be times where we have to face opposition, and we have to face exhaustion and things like that. And it is going to be inconvenient at times to be a servant of God. But we have to fulfill our purpose. We must, as Christians, serve him. I mean, you look at his wonderful statement. The Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. No matter what the cost, no matter what he had to endure, he was going to serve God, and he was going to seek and save the lost and to give his life a ransom for many. I'm going to wrap it up this morning by making this point. Christ was not going to die on the cross by accident. He knew where he was going. He knew how the story was going to end. He knew what he was going to have to experience. And everything that he did, every step of the way, was to lead to that point. He didn't do it by accident. He did it purposely. He did it so that you and I could have our sins washed away. And he did it so that you and I could spend our lives purposely serving God. Brethren, just like Christ didn't die on the cross by accident, brethren, we're not going to serve him, and we're not going to reach heaven by accident either. We have to be purposeful servants as well. We have to ask ourselves, what is our purpose, and how are we accomplishing it? What can we do to fulfill it, and what do we have to get through in order to continue to serve God? With that in mind, the invitation is going to be pretty simple this morning. If you're going through something and you need strength, you need encouragement to continue to be a servant of God, let us know. We'd love to pray for you, pray with you. We'd love to help to strengthen you, to encourage you. We would love to help serve you as you live a purposed life of a servant. And again, if you're not a Christian this morning, what a better thing to do than to start a life of purpose by becoming a Christian, by obeying the gospel and being baptized for the forgiveness of sins. Because we must be a people of purpose if we're going to see heaven. And we must make it our goal each and every day to have the purpose in our lives that we are going to serve God. All right, guys, thanks for your time. Look forward to seeing you next week when the heat comes back and maybe we're not so cold. Everybody try to stay safe and stay warm, and if we can help you, let us know. Love you guys. We'll see you next week. Bye.